So do you want to begin with that statement about your that hierarchy of values?
Oh well, I'm not sure that I remember the way I said it correctly, and in any case, I think it's probably a rather hazardous statement of mine. My feeling certainly is that freedom is on top of my values. Russia is probably second. Scholarship is probably third. Family fourth. Well, I don't.
Well, I think that covered the hierarchy that you had mentioned to me.
I think roughly that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So perhaps we should go back to the narrative then.
Well, I have one question that arises. That being the case, how would, if Russia's second in your hierarchy and scholarship's third, if it came to writing about the two?
Collision.
Collision.
Yes. Well, that's precisely what happened.
Well, why a collision? Because you would never think you were serving Russia by in any way compromising your scholarship. It seems to me there's a close fit.
In a different sense, perhaps I neglected my scholarship many times.
Mm-hmm.
I was prompted to formulate it like that because we had some Russian immigrants here unavoidably. I hadn't known them before, and husband and wife, and I think they said that how was it for them? They're great religious bigots. The church was first. The health was second, and money was third, or something like that. Some such combination. And I was prompted to say that my hierarchy was quite different. I wasn't a churchy person, and health was way down. My interests and money, not at all. I mean, they seemed seriously to think that money mattered.
That's very American. It's very American to think that.
He was a retired banker, and she was, I don't know. I don't think she ever worked outside house.
I see. I wanted to pursue this line of inquiry a little bit further, if I may. As a hypothetical question,
Yes.
were your scholarship to run contrary to Russia, how would that play itself out?
That's interesting. As George says, I haven't encountered that situation yet. It would depend on what my perception was of Russia. And as far as scholarship is concerned, I think I'm reasonably clear about what it is. But as far as Russia is concerned, it would depend on a particular situation, I think.
You, in my opinion, are the antithesis of an individual who would tailor his scholarship to meet some preconceived end. And if Russia were the preconceived end in this case,
yes. Well, I don't think it's preconceived. That's the point. I think Russia is more empirical for me than scholarship is more set, is more definite, and perhaps too narrow. But as George says, I don't think I've encountered a situation when these two would conflict. So I don't know. I haven't encountered.
Yeah, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems everything you've ever talked about was that there could not be a conflict between truth and Russia's genuine interest. Russia's opposed to any regime or any institution.
George, what about Isaiah Berlin's value of pluralism?
Well,
you can't assume this a priori. That's his point.
Well,
the values may or may not be compatible. So you can't simply assume that they are compatible. You have to look at the particular set of, and Russia is a very large notion.
well, I presume that that's correct, but I can't imagine it happening in your mind.
I don't know. I'm a historian, not a futurologist.
Okay. Should we go back to
sure.
the narrative? What did you want to add? Something?
No, what I think may happen to some people is that they would try somehow to whitewash some nastiness in Russian history, in the present, and somehow tailor their scholarship. I don't think I've done that in the past, but I don't think that is good for Russia.
Yep.
Whitewashing. So in this case, the values are compatible.
Yes.
So I don't know. Haven't thought of that. And anyways, I say that was an impromptu statement of mine about this hierarchy. I was simply incensed by the money. Admittedly, he was a retired banker. I suppose my money ranks high in the hierarchy.
Well, should we go back to the Romanian occupation?
Well, whichever.
The last thing you talked about yesterday was your encounter with the two SS folks,
yes,
and
yes.
your...
Well, I was able to escape on that occasion, but it was also very important for me because he said he thinks you are a Jew and wants to shoot you, and it somehow made it absolutely clear to me what the degree of arbitrariness and lawlessness there was. He thinks you are a Jew and he wants to shoot you.
It does bring to mind something you once told me, that when the Germans invaded and the regime propaganda about how awful they were and their murderous anti-Semitism and such, that your father was skeptical.
Yes, my father was, but that was before, just at the very beginning of the war.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
At the very beginning of the war, the same day or next day or something like that, we discussed this with him, and he said, "Oh, the Germans are a kulturny narod." He'd never seen the Germans from Germany himself, but that was a general feeling in Russia. They are kulturny narod. This is probably that communist propaganda. They couldn't be quite there. Germans kulturny narod. I was skeptical about that, and I had read some stuff about it. It was was published during those 2 years, 39, 41, less than 2 years, when they were friendly governments, and some information was available. So I thought I knew more. But talking about my father, I don't think I mentioned when we were talking about arresting all the communist leadership. I told my father about these ideas of ours, and he said, they all should be put into a collective farm. That was the punishment. That was peasants were always most important for him. He was a sort of right-wing populist, and so the worst possible punishment would be to put them into a collective farm, and forbid them to elect Stalin, their chairman.
That's great.
Well, after you got away from this SS,
Yes. Then there were a few weeks, I remember, I forget now how long, or a week and 2 weeks or 10 days or something like that, and then the Germans came, and the Germans became the occupation authority in Anapa, and there was a town commandant, a captain, whose name I don't now remember, unfortunately. He was an elderly man. He had reached the rank of captain in the First World War and was still a captain, and was used for such non-combat purposes. In civilian life, he was a teacher and a Schulrat, which means the head of a district educational administration somewhere in Oldenburg, I think, in northwest Germany. And so he installed now a raion administration of local Russians, staffed entirely by teachers. It was easier for him because the town there was already a teacher installed by the Romanians, and so on his advice he talked to him, both being old teachers, and whom could Ivan Ipach Gavrilov recommend, but other teachers, he wouldn't know anybody else. and so it was staffed entirely by teachers, and the person who was put in charge of the you were called raion chef, the chief of the raion, was a mathematics teacher, Leonid Kondratich Guba, whom my parents knew reasonably well. He was my sister's mathematics teacher also. And I had met him once only before. He was sent to our school as an inspector, sort of temporary inspector from the raion educational department. So I knew him slightly, and he pinched me from Gavrilov, from the town administration into the raion administration. So I was his secretary. It was mostly because I could understand German to some degree and could speak German to some degree. He didn't, and he frequently had to have contact with the commandant and his wardens there, and he didn't trust their official interpreter, who was a Czech, who thought he knew Russian, and his command of Russian was rather peculiar sometimes, and so Daniel Kondrach Guba, he was a Kuban Cossack by descent, would often take me with him when going to talk to in the commandatura, and I remember a few of those occasions. An example of how difficult it was for to understand what was what. The person in charge at the commandatura, in charge of civilian affairs, was their Zahlmeister, which means cashier, literally the military cashier. But he was also in charge of the civilian administration. And so I remember Daniel Kondrach Guba receiving a letter from him saying that all Soviet laws, statutes were being annulled, and no Soviet law was to be effective. And Daniel Kondrach asked him, so what laws should be effective? Oh, and no judicial or other authorities could be installed. So Daniel Kondrach said, what if there is a criminal or civil case? People get married and get divorced, and God knows what. Well, and the answer I remember very clearly. I didn't understand the meaning. That's very significant. I didn't understand the answer. He said, we don't want to abolish Russian law. We are abolishing communist statutes, communist laws. Neither of us could understand the meaning. What does he mean? The provisional government legislation, or the pre-1917 legislation, or what? Mm-hmm. And you see, in his mind, and obviously Hitler hadn't yet destroyed the national law to the degree that it had been destroyed in Russia. What was obvious, the meaning of what he was saying was obvious to this German official, and it was completely incomprehensible to us. And Daniel Kondrach said, so what should we do? And he said, well, you can appoint a legal advisor to yourself, and you will have to solve all these questions on his advice. All right, if that's the order of that. And he found an old Russian lawyer, actually a brother of a rather prominent Redesko, a prominent lawyer and politician, a cadet, member of the Duma, and later one of the prominent Smenovechцы, national Bolsheviks, Redesko. But he was the brother, he's simply practicing lawyer. And so if a couple wanted to get divorced, they would be referred to this advisor, and he would he would listen to them and advise the new convention. The new convention would, by his decree, either let or not let them get divorced or whatever. Serious criminal offences were to be referred to the field gendarmerie of the German commandatur. There was a lieutenant of the field gendarmerie, military police, and they were to be referred. I don't remember any.
I wouldn't imagine anybody want to do that.
I don't. Well, I don't remember any case of that. But then they also installed in the town. They installed. I don't know the process of that. I was no longer there. They installed the local Russian police. I remember that because much later in England, I met at some sort of a meeting someone who turned out to be a member of that police in Anapa, and he told me that they had a list of people to be shot after the. Well, we haven't talked about their killing of Daniil Konradovich Kuba yet, but we shall come to that perhaps. But he said I was on that second list to be shot, and that was when that German lieutenant, he may even have known about that, although I doubt it. He told me to disappear as quickly as possible, and probably saved my life. But we haven't talked about. We shall talk about that later, I think. They also installed a. I mean, my impression is that that police was mostly harassing people. Wasn't much of a police. They also installed a raion gendarmerie, a Cossack. It's composed of Cossacks. It's a Cossack area, and someone found, I don't know who, perhaps the Kondrach himself or whoever, found a former Cossack equivalent of lieutenant. I forget now what their ranks were called in the Cossack forces, who would spend some time in the concentration camp under Stalin and was very, very furious, was hated the communist regime. I remember unreasonably, fanatically, on one occasion, I remember there was a bridge broke down and between Anapa and another Estanica, a village outside, and he would usually come every morning and report to Kondrach Kuba that everything was all right in the military language, in the unit that he was entrusted to his charge or whatever. And once I remember he reported about that bridge being destroyed. It was probably just rotten, but he said it was had been blown up by some saboteurs, communist saboteurs from that village, and he would annihilate that village and whatnot. And I remember the new Kondrach calmed him down. But that again, I don't remember their doing anything, either of those. I think that it was, as far as these were concerned, it was simply a way of getting some employment and there was hardly any employment, and so getting some employment, and for this Cossack lieutenant, somehow a feeling that he was an officer again and reporting to his superior.
I'm quite aware of that that mentality, believe me.
So it was so completely alien to me, so I remember. But I remember one occasion when Daniel Kondrach went to the commandatura, to the commandant himself. It was rather late in the day. If I remember correctly, he was told that a German unit recently just arrived had been billeted at the house that was the town library, and they were throwing books out of the windows from the second floor. And so Daniel Kondrach asked me to accompany him to the commandant, and was furious, and expressed his indignation to the commandant. The commandant, being teacher himself, immediately called that lieutenant of the field gendarmerie. And the building, that cashier was also in charge of billeting, and so it was his fault. The commandant was furious with him, and ordered the lieutenant to go and throw out the soldiers, and that cashier had to give them some other quarters. They left. They didn't take books inside again, so they were being taken back by the library staff. But that I remember very, very clearly. I think it was partly perhaps because he was a teacher himself, but partly another sign to me that the Nazis had not yet succeeded in destroying some traditions. My father wasn't entirely wrong. He just exaggerated or underestimated, whatever. There were a couple of incidents like that. But there was also another incident of the library being destroyed. That was later in Askaninovo, in the southern Ukraine, much later, I think in late summer '43, when Askaninovo is a nature preserve and a research establishment for acclimatization of exotic species and things like that. And they were restoring the zubr, the European wild, what do you call those? Well, like American bisons, but the European version of those. They're precisely by crossing them with bisons and trying to restore the European species gradually, and things like that. And there was a library, a scientific library, which was sealed by the Rosenberg staff, as it was referred to. And now, people like myself, naive perhaps, thought that they wanted to preserve that library. I later learned they wanted to grab it and remove it to Germany. So that was why it was sealed and no one was allowed to enter that library. And one day, the old man whose main work was to stuff animals and things like that. I forget now what.
Taxidermist.
Taxidermist. But he was also sort of vaguely in charge of that library to see that no one tried to enter it. Came and it was in a panic, saying that two women had come and they were going through the books and throwing out lots of books in that library. Now, a few days before, a new German official, the Gebietskommissar, that was the arrangement where there was civilian